So while the Samanids in the 10th century can be credited with bringing about the revival of Persian culture and literature and playing a huge role in what we can call the Iranization of Islamic civilization, they were also essentially the last ethnically Iranian empire, imperial state. That is to say that from the 10th century onwards, Iran is going to be ruled by non-Iranians, essentially by Turks. And so what happens in the 10th century is that as the Samanid Empire becomes increasingly corrupt and goes into decline, they become vulnerable to raids from Turkish tribes, the Karakhanids in particular, raiding them from the steppes. By this period, the steppe regions have pretty much been taken over by Turkic tribes, and the Karakhanids are the first to adopt Islam, which they apparently do for mainly political reasons. That is to say, their ambitions are to conquer regions that are inhabited by Muslims, and in order to acquire legitimacy over the subject population, they see it appropriate to embrace Islam and to present themselves as champions of Sunni Islam. Bear in mind that in the 10th century, much of the Muslim world had been under the control of Shiite dynasties. We have the Buyid dynasty, which is basically controlling the caliphate based in Baghdad. Further west, we have the Fatimid dynasty, which is based in Egypt. And the Fatimids are, of course, sending Shiite missionaries, and this is causing a lot of trouble to the Sunni leadership in the eastern part of the Muslim world. So the Samanids, at the same time as they are promoting Persian culture, they're also positioning themselves as champions of Sunni Islam in a time when most Muslims are Sunni but are living under the rule of Shia governments. So the Samanids are trying to contrast themselves with the other Islamic governments, saying that we're more authentic, we're more legitimate because we're promoting Sunni Islam. So Bukhara, their capital, becomes a huge, very important center of religious scholarship. Comes to be known as Bukhara-i-Sharif, Holy Bukhara, name that the city is still referred to by many even today. However, again, the dynasty does go into decline the second half of the 10th century, and eventually by around the year 1007, the Karahanid Turks put an end to the Samanid dynasty once and for all, and they take over these territories. And this begins a period of about 900 years, going right up to the 20th century, when the Iranian world is going to be ruled by dynasties of Turkish origin. But what's interesting is, during this period of practically a millennium, is that the Turks, in fact, become the #1 champions of Iranian culture. And we can attribute this to their public relations needs. Again, they're being seen by the settled peoples as barbarians from the steppes. They need to sort of present themselves as being civilized. And being civilized means A, being Muslim, and B, being culturally a promoter of Iranian civilization. So this means promoting not only just adopting Iranian norms in terms of your behavior, your social etiquette, and so forth, also the administrative techniques that have, going back to the Sasanian Empire, but also being a patron, because one of the ways that you show that you're a great and legitimate and powerful ruler is by spending a lot of money on patronage of the arts and the sciences and things like that. So on the one hand, they They would support the building of Islamic seminaries and paying salaries to Islamic scholars to show that they're good Muslims and supporting Islam. They would also promote other aspects of culture. They would hire the best musicians, the best painters, the best architects to build and to, in the Iranian styles. And again, this continues, although there are quite a few dynasties of Turkic origin that come in one after the other. As one dynasty becomes more settled and urbanized and less sort of in the mindset of fighting and being out on the battlefield, they become more vulnerable to the next wave of Turkic tribes coming in from the steppes that take over, and then the same thing repeats itself again and again. So we have ongoing waves of new Turkic dynasties coming out of Central Asia, and basically the pattern repeats itself. But what is characteristic of this pattern is that they each do the same thing. They become urbanized, they become Muslim, and they become culturally Persian and great promoters of Persian culture. So it's quite interesting that that in fact the credit for the expansion and promotion and flourishing of a lot of the cultural phenomena that we associate with Iran and Persian, actually the credit can be given to Turkic elites that promoted and patronized these things. Now, the first great Turkic empire that arose in the 11th century was the empire of the Ghaznavids. They were called that because they came from Ghazni, which is a town in southeastern Afghanistan. And the most associated with Mahmud of Ghazna, who's depicted here in a later painting from the Mongol period, and he's shown here at court receiving some religious scholars. And Mahmud is the first, in particular, he's known for being the Muslim ruler who made the first permanent conquests in India. And so the history of Islam in India, although there are some Arab conquests in the Indus Valley in the 8th century, the lasting penetration of Islamic power into northern India begins with Mahmud, his many raids into India, and is setting up eventually of dynasties, Muslim dynasties ruling from Delhi and other parts of India, which goes on right up until the 19th century. And so Mahmud, again, characteristically promoting Persian culture, although he's identified as a Turk. In fact, like many Turks seeking to be upwardly mobile, his father married an Iranian woman. So in fact, Mahmud was half Iranian. But that, in this patriarchal culture of the time, that aspect of his identity gets played down. But I think it was surely important. Certainly his mother and her culture had an influence on him. And we should recall that Mahmud was the final patron, not the original patron, of the Shahnameh that was commissioned by the Samanids, but the Samanids by now are no longer in power, and Ferdowsi does not complete the Shahnameh until Mahmud has taken power, and so it's to Mahmud that he presents it. And he's disappointed in the amount of money that Mahmud gives him, but in any case, we have this phenomenon where Mahmud is officially the patron of what has come to be recognized as really one of the foundations of Persian literary culture. So again, this is characteristics. We see that rulers and elites who are ethnic Turks are promoting Persian culture. Here we have a fairly recent depiction of Mahmud and his famous lover, the slave boy Ayaz, who is said to have been the most beautiful man who ever lived. So there are a lot of jokes about, a lot of naughty jokes about Mahmud and Ayaz. But in any case, this is a trope that has gone down through history. Mahmud's love for his slave boy, who actually happens to have been a Christian from Georgia. This is a fortress that was built by Mahmud in his time. It's in southeastern Afghanistan, so although it's in ruins now, you can see what a massive fortress it was at the time. So, as I mentioned, within usually a number of decades, each of these Turkic dynasties is overtaken by a new dynasty, and so the Ghaznavids are eventually pushed out by another group of Turks called the Seljuks, who take over the Iranian heartlands here, and it's actually the Seljuks that are able to accomplish something that the Arabs were never able to accomplish. The Arabs basically got pushed back once they got to the Taurus Mountains in southern Anatolia when they were attacking Byzantium. But the Seljuks actually were able to defeat the main Roman army at the Battle of Manzikert in the year 1071. That's here in what's now eastern Turkey. And that began the push of the Turkification and the Islamization of Anatolia, which was formerly inhabited by Greeks and Armenians, a Christian region, part of the Roman Empire, but beginning in 1071, Muslim Turks pushing more and more into the Roman territory, ultimately resulting in 1922 with the expulsion of Greeks and Armenians from what became the Republic of Turkey after World War I, so that it's now an ethnically Turkish region. So the Seljuks, again, promoting themselves as champions of Sunni Islam, and they spent a lot of money on building seminaries. The Seljuk prime minister, an Iranian by the name of Nizam ul-Mulk, or he was called Nizam ul-Mulk, he set up a system of universities, which were called Nizamiyas, the most important one being at Baghdad, but there were others built as well, and these were centers for training Sunni Islamic scholars to promote Sunni Islam, particularly with the ongoing threat of the Ismaili Shiites who had set up castles throughout Syria and Iran, which were basically impenetrable, and the Seljuks could not dislodge them. So we have the Battle of Manzikert here in 1071, Seljuks moving and taking over Mecca and Medina, but coming up against the Shiite Fatimids here. So originally coming from Central Asia, moving into Iran, and then pushing into Turkey. So challenging the Byzantines here, challenging the Fatimids here, but taking over the major centers of Islamic civilization, Baghdad and then the holy cities in the Hijaz here. And here's some examples of Seljuk architecture, the architecture that's remained, tombs here, for example, some of the Seljuk rulers. Here's a caravanserai, what you can call a medieval hotel. These were places that caravans would stop for the night. You can still see the ruins of these things all across the Silk Road, across Iran and Central Asia today. And you can see the typical Iranian architecture with the arched avans, as they're called, the arched entryways, and the courtyards here. Here's an entryway to one of these caravanserais. Okay, they also built, again, they spent a lot of money on monumental architecture. Here they established a capital at Esfahan in central Iran, and they built the Congregational Mosque, which is used for Friday prayers. Again, here you see that they're using traditional Iranian architecture, the floral designs with glazed tiles, the Mokarnas kind of beehive look thing here, the different kinds of Quranic calligraphy here you can see on the minarets, around some of these areas. These are Quranic inscriptions. This is all glazed tiles. Again, here this is also calligraphy, the names of God, Muhammad. And here you have the courtyard of the main mosque in Esfahan, which still exists today. So one of the more famous Seljuk monuments. And here you have the view up to the dome, where the decorations have fallen away in the last 900 years, but you can still imagine what it was like. And here you get another part where the tiles have still remained. And here you have again a tomb, a Seljuk era tomb in eastern Iran. You have the tomb of Sultan Sanjar, who was one of the great Seljuk rulers. This is actually in modern-day Turkmenistan. And again, this sort of quadrangular thing, this is basically modeled on the Zoroastrian fire temple. So again, you see a continuation here of very ancient Iranian architectural styles. Muhammad Ghazali was the most famous theologian at the Nizamiya of Baghdad in the 11th century. He was very, very influential, wrote many, many books which have become sources of guidance and instruction that are used by Sunni Muslims up to the present day. He, at a certain point, quit his job and ran off to Syria and became a Sufi. He says it was for spiritual reasons, but I suspect something that may have had to do with it also is that the Sultan Malik Shah, the Sultan of the Seljuk Sultan at the time, basically forced him to write a book against Ismaili Shiism. And because there were a lot of assassinations going on at that time, the word assassin comes from the Ismailis who were performing this spectacular public killings of political figures that had been persecuting the Ismaili community. And in fact, Nizam al-Mulk, the prime minister, who was very close to Ghazali, who had hired him, he was one of the victims of these assassinations. And I think that Ghazali may have feared for his life after writing that book, and maybe ran off to Syria to sort of keep a low profile, hide out in a Sufi lodge and study Sufism for 10 years, which is what he did. Here is one of the famous castles, the most famous castle actually of the assassins in Alamut in the Alborz Mountains in the north of Iran. You can see it's built up on the top of a rock here, and it's really would have been impossible to climb up here. There is a secret back way that is not, now it's not secret anymore because the tourist office has made this path so that you can get up there. But in medieval times, it would have been impossible to penetrate. And in fact, the Seljuks tried for 200 years to attack this castle and others like it that the Ismailis controlled, and they couldn't do it. It wasn't until the Mongols came along that the Mongols were finally able to kick them out, and they did that apparently by some kind of trickery and not by actual conquest. Here we have one of the most famous citizens of the Seljuk Empire, Jalaluddin Rumi, who was originally from what's now Tajikistan, but as the Mongols were attacking out of the east in the early 13th century, he and his family fled westwards, and they made it as far as the city of Konya, which had only recently been taken by the Seljuks from the Romans, from the Byzantines. And so that region was still called Rome, or Rum, which is why Jalaluddin came to be known as Rumi the Roman, because he lived in a region that was still known as Rome, even though the Seljuks had just taken it over. And there is his shrine in Konya, which you can visit today. A mixture of Iranian and Ottoman architecture. It's a very Iranian kind of dome here, but then this lead-covered domes here and this minaret, they're very typical of Ottoman architecture. And here we have the famous whirling dervishes. Rumi is credited with inventing this dance, which was intended to be a way that you could, spin around listening to music and work yourself into an ecstatic trance, so, to alter your state so that you could be more receptive to experiencing the divine reality. And this guy here in the middle, in the black, he is the spiritual master, the sheikh or the pir, and his role is to sort of guide all the disciples, because they spin around and eventually they get dizzy and they might pass out, and he sort of, grabs them and keeps them, holding them up, and he'll sort of usher them off to the side if he thinks that they are no longer able to dance. So he's there to sort of look after their well-being. Okay, so then we have the next big wave is, of course, the Mongols. And the Mongols were not Muslims, and they were not Turks. At least the leaders were not Turks, although the Mongol army was multi-ethnic. And as the Mongols spread, coming out of here, out of Mongolia, this region, moving in all directions, it was one of these tribal confederations that just kept getting bigger and bigger, like a snowball effect. So the more they succeeded in conquering territories, the more different tribes would join them. And in fact, probably the majority of the Mongol army were ethnic Turks, but they're known as the Mongol army because the leadership was Mongol. And there's a close relationship between Mongols and Turks anyway. The languages are not related, but culturally they're very, very similar. Steppe nomads, again, coming out of the eastern part of Central Asia. So Genghis Khan and his successors, Kublai Khan, they conquer all these regions all the way to Europe, southern Russia, Ukraine, pretty much the entire Iranian world, up to the borders of India, Tibet, and all of China and Korea. They launch a naval attack on Japan, which fails. But you can see this is the biggest empire that the world had ever seen at this point in the middle of the 13th century. Once Genghis Khan died, the empire was divided up amongst his sons, and their sons, and eventually, within a decade or two, the original empire was divided into four, and they each had their own sort of history. So we have the Golden Horde here, which becomes, in a way, Russified. They become, come into contact with the Slavic population here, and the Tatars of Russia today are descended from these members of the Mongol hordes that conquered in the 13th century. So they become sort of a part of Russian history. In the east here we have the Khanate of the Great Khan, who was Kublai, who ruled from Karakorum here in what's now Mongolia, and ruled over all China and Tibet here. And this Khanate this region became very Sinicized. So we have what's known as the Yuan dynasty in the history of China, which was a dynasty run by Mongols, but eventually they become Buddhist and become culturally Chinese. So that this dynasty only remains as a distinctly Mongol dynasty for about 100 years. Here in the Muslim world, we have in Central Asia the so-called Chagatai Khanate, which covers what's now Uzbekistan, the Xinjiang region of China, Kazakhstan. These regions were part of the Chagatai Khanate, which was culturally Persianized and Sunni Muslim, as it remains up to today. And then we have the Islamic heartlands here, very Persianized, basically from the Euphrates River all the way to Afghanistan and Central Asia here, including the Caucasus mountain region here. And this was all called the Ilkhanate. And again, for about 100 years, retained a Mongol identity, but they quickly became Muslim and acquired a Persian cultural identity, and lose their Mongol culture within 100 years or so. Here's one of the most famous monuments of the Ilkhans, perhaps the most famous in Sultaniya in northwestern Iran. Again, you can see typical Iranian architecture here. And the Ilkhans, interestingly, had a series of Jewish prime ministers who were Jewish, who nominally converted to Islam in order to get their political job, but seem to have retained their Jewish identity. And interestingly, there are about 4 of them in a row that eventually fell out with the rulers and were executed on the basis of being fake Muslims. And of course, everybody knew they were fake Muslims all along, but that it was fine to have that as an open secret up until the politicians needed a reason to get rid of them because they were too powerful. So the most famous of these was a fellow by the name of Rashid ad-Din Fazlullah. And he was a famous physician, as many of the successful Jews at court were. They were originally hired as physicians, but scholars at that time, of course, usually were experts in many fields. So you could be a physician, and you could also be an astronomer, and you could also be an artist and a writer and all kinds of things. So Rashid ad-Din's most lasting legacy was that he wrote a world encyclopedia, basically wrote a history of the world up until the Mongols, basically starting with Adam and Eve and going throughout all of human history up till the culminating point, the end of history from that perspective, which was the coming of the glorious Mongols, who were his bosses, who he worked for, who paid for this project. So basically we have, and it's illustrated. The Mongols, most of them couldn't read, so they like to have books read to them. This was often the case for elites. Remember that most people were illiterate in pre-modern times, and that included politicians. But they, if they were rich enough, they could pay for people to copy out books for them, and then they could have them read out to them as entertainment. But very often they paid to have them illustrated as well, because if you don't know how to read, it's fun to have pictures to look at to accompany the stories that you're hearing. So this world history, Jamia Tavarikh, as it's called, or collection of histories, is very, very richly illustrated with scenes from all the different things that are depicted. But what's interesting here is that we see that the heroic figures, which may be anyone from Alexander to the Great to the Prophet Muhammad to whatever, they are all depicted as Mongols. They all have these facial features of Mongols, and that's of course a way of flattering your patrons. The Mongols who are paying you, the artists will flatter their patrons by painting heroes to look like Mongols. And what's interesting here is that, of course, Iran has a great artistic tradition going back to ancient times, but with the coming of Islam and Islamic scholars originally basically taking an iconoclastic position opposing representational art. So it became something of a stereotype in Islamic law that representational art is forbidden. And so most artists went into graphic arts, and that's why we have calligraphy and floral designs and these kinds of things become very sophisticated in the early Islamic centuries. But the Mongols, they really liked representational art. So once they were in charge, they encouraged artists to go back to painting. So we have a revival of ancient Iranian painting traditions from the Mongol period onwards, and it continues right up to the present day. So that's one of the things that the Mongols can get credit for, is reviving Persian painting. So here we have another depiction of another example of an illustrated page. This one's talking about Alexander the Great. Here's Alexander. Again, he looks like a Mongol, not like a Greek. But this is a scene in a story about Alexander where he comes upon this tree with all these heads. It's a talking tree, and basically these talking heads are predicting his imminent death. So, and he doesn't listen to them, of course, and meets his fate. So this is all, this is all the text here, and then you have the painting, which is illustrating the story that's being told in the text. Here's another painting from the same manuscript of Rashid ad-Din. This is from pre-Islamic Persian history. This is Bahram Gur, one of the famous Sasanian kings, and he has here killed a wolf, pretty bloody and graphic here. And again, he's looking rather Mongol as well. Here you have a painting from illustrated Shahnameh, and the Mongols here begin a long tradition of non-Iranian rulers who come to rule over the Iranian world and attempt to portray themselves as legitimate rulers by, in a sense, inserting themselves into the long line of historical Iranian rulers. And the best way to do that is by championing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. So you spend a huge amount of money to get artists and calligraphers to produce a wonderful copy of the Shahnameh, and then it gets associated with you, and in a sense you're then putting yourself into that tradition as one of these great historical or legendary Iranian rulers. So this continues again right up to the 19th century. This is something that pretty much all rulers in Iranian territory do, is they show themselves to be great patrons of culture by paying for expensive copies of the Shahnameh. So this is one done in the Mongol period, and it's a depiction of a scene where a very tragic scene where Rostam's heroic horse, Raksh, whom he depends on very much, has been treacherously killed by somebody has set up one of these traps where you put these spikes in a pit and then you cover it up, and the horse gallops over the pit and then falls in and is killed on the spikes. And Rostam is really angry, of course, and the person who is who's committed this act hides behind a tree, but Rostam fires an arrow which is so powerful that it penetrates the tree and kills the perpetrator. But Rostam is heartbroken because he's lost his horse. So after the Mongols, we have a period of, again, fragmentation, but again, we have in the 14th century, we have another leader emerge out of Central Asia, a Turkic fellow by the name of Temur, who's known in the West as Tamerlane from his Persian epithet Temur-e Lang, which means limp Timur, because he apparently had an accident as a youth and spent his life walking in a limp. And this is a facial reconstruction done by Russian sculptor Gerasimov in the Soviet period, when they became very popular to dig people out of their tombs and then do these facial reconstructions on their skulls. And so this is probably pretty much what Tamerlane looked like, as they dug him up and made this bust from his skull. So Tamerlane saw himself as a second Genghis Khan. He was originally from this region, what's now Uzbekistan. He made Samarkand his capital, and he began his conquests. He reconquered the entire Iranian world, the Caucasus, and then ran up against the Ottomans, who had established their empire by then. In Anatolia, another Turkic group ran up against the Mamluk Empire, the so-called slave empire that was ruling Egypt and Syria at that time. So he establishes this and then runs up against India here. He does sack Delhi in 1398, which becomes the pretext for his descendants 5 generations later to attack Delhi, saying, well, it's ours because our great-great-great-grandfather conquered it. They become the founders of the Mongol Empire in the 16th century. But so during Timur's life, he manages to conquer all this area. So it's nowhere near as big as what the territory that Genghis Khan conquered, but it's still pretty impressive, and it unites, most of the Iranian world and the adjacent regions, and like the previous such Central Asian nomadic rulers, he becomes a great champion of Sunni Islam and a promoter of Iranian culture. So this is a tomb that he originally had built for, I think, his nephew, but he ended up getting buried there himself. This is in Samarkand. So we see a very impressive dome here, beautiful tile work with, again, the calligraphy, the Quranic inscriptions around here, and again, more calligraphy along the minarets here. This is the inside. This is black jade that he's buried underneath that. So that's what the Soviets dug up, brought out his skeleton in the 1960s, I think it was. This is a mosque that he had built for his favorite wife, so it's named after her. It's called the Bibi Khanum Mosque. It's also in Samarkand. At this time, when he made Samarkand his capital, it came to be known throughout the world as the most fabulous city on earth. So there's all these accounts by European travelers that are just totally, their breath is taken away. They just go back to Europe and are raving about this amazing city that Timur has built. Here's a modern statue of Timur. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the government of Uzbekistan has made the rather arbitrary decision to declare Timur the founder of the Uzbek nation, which is historically nonsense because the Uzbek tribe at the time were enemies of the Barlas tribe, which was Timur's tribe, and his historians have nothing but awful things to say about Uzbeks, so he's probably spinning in his grave right now, being called an Uzbek. But in any case, after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the statues of Marx and Lenin came down, and statues of Tamerlane went up in their place. And this is the entrance, or what's left of the entrance to the palace that he built in his hometown, which is called Shahr-e-Sabz, which is south of Samarkand. And it was originally the dome, if you have to imagine the archway going up here, but it collapsed. And this is also an earthquake-prone region, so that didn't help. So he told his architects to build the largest archway that had ever been built, and they did, but it collapsed. So he had the architects executed, got some more architects to build it again. It fell again. They got executed, and it went on like that. So it never really, I think, was complete. And this is just the entryway. The palace was actually behind that. But so much for his grandiose architectural schemes. And so his successor, Ulugh Beg, had this madrasa, seminary, built in Samarkand. Later, 2 more were built facing it, so it's now the main square in Samarkand known as the Registan, or Sandy Place. But this is the one that dates to the 15th century, to the Timurid period, so you can get a very good example of Timurid architecture here. Ulugh Beg was not much of an administrator, but he was a great scientist, and he was really into astronomy, and he had the world's greatest astronomical observatory built at that time, and he compiled his own astronomical table, which is considered by astronomers today to be pretty accurate. It's still considered useful. There's not much left of the observatory now, but it's been the artists have reconstructed that it would have looked like that. Another thing that the Timurids did, again, they patronized the arts, and so of course they patronized the painting. Here we have a Timurid era painting illustrating the Prophet Muhammad's miraculous night journey to heaven on this horse-like creature called the Burak and surrounded by angels. We can see the influence of Chinese art here, these clouds here, and this is again thanks to the Mongols opening up the trade routes to China and bringing, you know, artworks to the West. These features getting incorporated into Iranian art. See the prophet here, his face is not depicted. A concession to the resistance to depicting you know, representational art. Here we have another Timurid era painting, which is depicting a Quranic scene. This is Joseph, or Yusuf, as he's known in Arabic, who is considered a prophet in Islam. And this is the pharaoh's wife, who's named in the Quran as Zuleika. And if you know the story, you know, she falls in love with Joseph because he's so beautiful, and she tries to seduce him. And but he's a good and, you know, righteous person, so he refuses her advances. And then she gets angry and tells the pharaoh, "Oh, he tried to seduce me." And then they decide to put him on trial, but then they see that his clothes are ripped from behind, which proves that he was running away from her and not the other way around. So he's, you know, exonerated from that. What's interesting, and again, his face is not, you know, painted in because he's a prophet. Another interesting thing here, a very ancient Iranian iconographic technique in art is the fire that you see here, which is a version of the ancient Iranian halo, which of course makes its way into Christian art, Manichaean art, and Buddhist art, signifying a holy figure. In Islamic art, it tends to take the form of flames. So, you know, if you see flames leaping out from behind somebody's head, you know that it's depicting a prophet. Here we have a painting by the most famous painter of the time, a fellow by the name of Behzad. And in fact, one of the best compliments that you can give to a painter in Iran is to say, "Oh, you're like a second Behzad." And in fact, there's a pretty famous painter in Iran right now who calls himself Behzad for obvious reasons. Anyway, this is a painting depicting one of these Sufi dances, like I showed you a photograph of before, a modern version. So here again, you have the Sufis, you know, twirling around and going into ecstatic trances, and then you've got, you know, a couple of them have passed out down here at the bottom, and they have to be led away by their companions. So you see typical Timurid art here. Iranian painting tends to be flat in perspective. It's not meant to be photographic. It's not meant to represent the world as it is, but rather the world as it should be. So you always get these kind of bird's eye view where what's important is to see the details of all the things depicted. You know, so it's not so important with things that we would consider like perspective or things that we associate with accuracy. If you look at the details, you know, I mean, obviously it's not because they're amateurish that they don't use perspective. It's, you know, it's intentional. I mean, you look at like the beard on this guy. I mean, it's incredibly detailed. The flowers are very, very detailed. So there's a lot of skill involved here, but different artistic choices that are made in, you could say, Renaissance painting. Now, these illustrated manuscripts, again, it took a lot of money to pay for them because you had to have a lot of artists and calligraphers working on them. It took months and months. So it was really rich people doing this. And they did it largely for entertainment. These were things that would be passed around. Stories would be read out for entertainment at dinner parties and things like that. And then you know, people would look at the paintings and, you know, probably be getting drunk and, you know making jokes and enjoying this. So some themes are, you often find they're a bit titillating. So one thing that we often see is paintings of naked women bathing. And you see this guy up here peeping through the crack, you know, taking a look at the bathing women. This is a popular kind of thing that you see in a lot of these paintings. And again, you have to imagine the context. This would be basically a drunken party where people would be passing these things around. Another image here, you've got this prince who is going out hunting, and lo and behold, he comes upon this river, and there's all these naked women bathing in the river, and he's like, what's going on here? So then we have, again, after the Timurids, we have a sort of interregnum where Iran is fragmented into different principalities that are finally reunited again at the beginning of the 16th century by this fellow, Ismail Safavi. He is the hereditary master of the Safavid Sufi order, who are ethnically Kurdish, but being based in northwestern Iran. Most of their disciples are Turkmen nomads. So these are people that don't know anything about Islam, but they have a kind of popular semi-pagan religion inherited from the steppes, in which they have incorporated the figure of Ali as a kind of god. So this is where we get the term Alavi or Alawi. These sects, which are usually Kurdish or Turkmen, that revere Ali to the point of actually making him a kind of deity. So Shah Ismail, by the time he's about 12, he inherits the leadership of this order from his father, who dies. And they become increasingly militant because the Ottomans at this time from Istanbul, they're trying to impose their control on these territories and get these nomads to pay taxes and things like that. And the nomads don't like that. So the Safavids, beginning in the late 15th century, they start to become militant, and they start to preach that the Ottomans are bad Muslims and they're infidels, and so you should resist them on religious grounds. And so they start to pull on these Shiite ideas and the fact that these Turkmen really like Ali. They play on that to sort of give a kind of Shiite propaganda tone to their fight against the Ottomans. And eventually, Ismail manages to lead his army to take over most of Iran and a lot of the Ottoman territories. So you see that this area in orange is what he's able to conquer during his lifetime. He's fighting with the Uzbeks here in the northwest, so northeast. So you see that these are regions that are kind of going back and forth between the Safavids and the Uzbeks. Over here, they're fighting with the Ottomans, the poor Armenians caught in the middle, and the Kurds here. So these areas become kind of the battleground for the next 200 years between the Safavids and the Ottomans. The Safavids' first capital is Tabriz here in Azerbaijan. Shah Ismail's successor, Shah Tahmasp, moves the capital to Qazvin, which because Tabriz is considered too close to the Ottoman border, they're worried that it might get conquered. And eventually, Shah Abbas the Great, at the end of the 16th century, moves to Esfahan here in the center of Iran. So Shah Ismail, he, again, like as is the norm, he tries to show his culture by patronizing the arts, and he commissions, like everybody else, a copy of the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, which he wants to be the most beautiful copy of the Shahnameh ever made in history. And I think most art historians would agree that he succeeded in that. He got all the greatest artists in the Muslim world to come to Tabriz and to start working on this. This is my personal favorite painting ever. It's depicting sort of the origin of the world. This is Mars, who's the first man, and you've got this kind of Garden of Eden scene here where everybody's in harmony, the animals, the lion and lamb lying down together, and everything's beautiful. And this is just before Ahriman, the Zoroastrian Satan figure, attacks and ruins everything. So really fantastic painting, incredibly detailed. Here you have another scene. This from the Shahnameh. This is Feridun, one of the Shahnameh heroes, he's turned himself into a dragon because he wants to test his 3 sons and, you know, see if they're worthy or not. And you see the beautiful depiction of nature, the rocks and the stream. The stream, well, you can see this is gold paint. This is actual gold leaf paint, so it's still shiny and beautiful. Down here, the water was always painted in silver, but silver tarnishes over time, and that's why nowadays it looks black. Here's another famous scene from the Shahnameh. This is Zahak, the evil character, the evil ruler who's described in the Shahnameh as an Arab. He has these 2 snakes growing out of his shoulders, and these snakes have a voracious appetite, and they want to eat a human child every morning for breakfast. So Zahak, who comes to be known as the tyrant, he's a tyrant because every morning he has to have a couple innocent children brought to feed his snakes for breakfast, and this is really awful. So eventually the Iranians are able to capture him, and they chain him up on Mount Damavand, where he spends the rest of eternity having his innards being pecked at by vultures and eagles and things like that. You see these very Chinese-looking clouds up here again, an example of the influence of Chinese art. Now, all these figures here have these little red batons sticking out of their turbans, and that's because the Safavids identified themselves by doing this. It was a symbol of being, you know, a follower of the Safavid Sufi order. And in Turkish, they were called Kizilbash, or redheads, because of these things sticking out. So Kizilbash became kind of a tribal identity for the followers of the Safavids, and so that's why they're depicted this way. So again, you're flattering your patron. There were no Safavids or Kizilbash or anything at the time of the Shahnameh stories, but they're anachronizing here, and they are, you know, basically the artists are putting their patrons into this legendary history, painting them into this legendary history. It's interesting, you have a guy down here playing a saz, you know, playing music while this is going on. Interesting stuff going on here. Here you have another painting. You might notice the paintings are all different styles. That's because they're all done by different artists. So this collection of Shahnameh, it has all the best artists from around the Muslim world, and of course they had different styles, so that's why they look different. This is Rostam. We know it's Rostam because he wears this hat made out of a leopard skin. Here's his horse, Rakhsh. This is, of course, before his treacherous murder. Rostam is asleep, and this lion is going to attack him, but Rakhsh is on the job, and Rakhsh goes and defends, kills the lion while Rostam is sleeping. So that's a really good horse. Here again you see the river, which is now turned black. That originally would have been silver paint. And now we come to the greatest ruler of the Safavid period, Shah Abbas. Shah Abbas I, Shah Abbas the Great, as he's often called. And he's the one who moved the capital to Esfahan in the late 16th century and built Esfahan into a city that acquired the reputation as the most spectacular city in the world at the time, similar to what Tamerlane had done for Samarkand. And here you have a wall painting from one of his palaces depicting a dinner party. So, and that's Shah Abbas here, and then you've got these dancing girls here, and you have everybody serving cups of wine, and you have his courtiers here. Some of them are playing music. These guys are playing drums. So this is a Shah Abbas party scene. This is the big square that he built, which is called by different names. It's called Royal Square, Meydan-e-Shah, or it's called Khomeini Square if you're a revolution supporter. It's called Naqsh-e-Jahan, which is like a map of the world, or center of the world. So you'll hear it referred to by different names. This is a view from one end of the square to the other, and typical of urban architecture in Islamic cities. You have the center of town. is a square with the commercial and religious centers facing each other. So this is a view from the entrance to the bazaar, and it's looking towards the congregational mosque here at the other end of the square. Here you have the royal palace, the Ali Qapu as it's called, and up here, well, this was originally a polo ground, so Shah Abbas would sit up here on the balcony of his palace. He would watch these polo matches. Now you see it's just been turned over to recreation, a very popular place for people in Esfahan to hang out on the weekends. Here is a smaller mosque called the Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque, built by one of Shah Abbas's courtiers. And all around here you have shops, and most of them are Armenian shops because Shah Abbas brought a lot of Armenians to live in Esfahan. Now there's still an Armenian quarter called Jolfa, where Armenians are living, and even today most of the craftsmen in these shops are Armenians. Esfahan is famous for its crafts. It arguably produces the most beautiful crafts in Iran, even perhaps the Muslim world. So it's a bit ironic that most of these crafts are produced by Christians, by Armenians, in any case. Here you have a closer view of the entrance to the Friday Mosque. And again, you see the very, very elaborate tile work here. Very beautiful. These upper chambers here would have been dorm rooms for seminary students back in the day. Now again, you still see here the shops on the first floor. Here you have a view from the inside the dome. And you see the calligraphy. This is all glazed tiles. Lots and lots of